attend. I'm John Sandvig. Louise did me the honor of introducing me to the general session earlier, and it may have been a little bit overinflated. I am a volunteer for Citizens Climate Lobby. Okay, how many CCL members are in the room? Hey folks, I recognize many of you, but not all of you. And glad the rest of you are here as well. Just a little bit about me, so you understand where I'm coming from. I spent a career working for Boeing. I trained as an aeronautical engineer and then a manager and executive of the company. Retired a number of years ago. I've been aware of climate change and greenhouse gases all of my adult life, but didn't do anything about it. Mostly because I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't understand, or I wasn't aware of an approach that I thought would have the massive effect that was required all across our energy economy, that wouldn't also fundamentally just change, maybe even destroy our way of life. And so I was just stymied by it. I didn't know what to do. In retirement, I was introduced to Citizens Climate Lobby by a friend of mine who is an activist. Matter of fact, those of you in Olympia may know him quite well. David Fouch is the fellow who brought me into CCL. And he described not just the organization, but this policy, which we call carbon fee and dividend. Louise described it a little bit in the opening session for those of you who are not CCL folks. And you know, I'll be candid with you. When he first explained it to me, very briefly at a party, I thought, you know, I don't know, this sounds too good to be true. But I respected David enough that I went home and I studied up on it there at the CCL website. In particular, he mentioned the REMI report, which I also studied. And you know, I went from a skeptic, not a skeptic of climate science, but a skeptic about whether carbon fee and dividend could be effective, to realizing that, holy smokes, this is something that can actually work, can be effective, and can preserve not just our way of life, but actually expand the economy to create more jobs. So my world just kind of turned around with respect to climate action, climate activism. And so, you know, I've got two daughters. They're just about ready to start their own families. And I didn't want to be facing their children and their grandchildren with the question, you know, hey, Grandpa, how come you didn't do something about climate when you had the chance? Right? So that's what's turned me on this, the combination of this idea. This the carbon fee and dividend proposals really got me going. I'm not saying that all the other things that we can do for climate are also equally good. For me personally, this carbon fee and dividend idea has really energized me. So that's where I'm coming from. This is one of the CCL sessions, and so I'm bringing to this particular talk that Citizens Climate Orientation. Bringing to this the context of seeking to work on federal legislation, as distinct from what we heard from Beth just a little while ago about Washington state legislation, federal legislation that can actually be viable and durable. And that's all kind of wrapped up in the carbon fee and dividend proposal. Okay? So much of what you're going to see has been sort of directed to that context. Okay? Those of you who are not CCL, not CFD adherents yet, might find this, you know, maybe mistargeted a little bit. I hope that's not the case, because I think you'll see some things here that will be perfectly applicable to any kind of context across the political divides. So where are we going to head on this thing? We're going to talk a little bit about moral theory, and then we're going to try and understand what the divisions are to some degree. I think I can say with confidence that more than 90% of the people in this room will self-identify as liberal or progressive. Okay? So recognizing that I think it's a fact. I don't know it for a fact, but I think it's going to be true. This talk is oriented more toward trying to reach conservatives, okay? But I also want to acknowledge that the divide is real, and it's just as big an issue for liberals and progressives for conservatives to reach liberals and progressives, okay? So we'll have both flavors here to some extent, and we'll talk a little bit about some techniques that I hope will be helpful to you. So let's get started with moral theory. First off, I want to recommend to you Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. This is the research that Haidt has conducted. Haidt and some other folks serves as the foundation for much of what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. Who here is familiar with this book? Good, a few of you. That's great. Well, you know, if you're really interested in understanding folks who think a little bit differently than you do, I can't recommend this book more strongly. There's three principles that are really important for us to understand that come out of Haidt's writing. Incidentally, he is a social psychologist.
Sure, we got a camera going on here. Sorry about that.
On moral psychology and systematic research to understand it for 25 years or something like that. So he's got a wealth of actual experimental data behind his findings. And here are three things that I think are really important.
Yeah, I know, it's running.
So the first one, intuition comes first and reason follows.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to play.
I don't know about you, but you know, the first time I saw this, I stumbled over it. I thought, that's not right. We have an intuition, but our reason rules our intuition, not the other way around. Our intuition can be right or wrong, but our reason goes to work to guide our intuition, right? His research says, no, that's not right. His research says intuition comes first, and we instantly or very rapidly form an opinion about the situation and the circumstances and the people that we're interacting with. And this goes back to, no kidding, there's evidence that there are genetic bases for this kind of thing, instant intuition. And then we put our cognitive brains to work to substantiate and support what we intuit. That's just backwards from the way I thought we behaved. I don't know about you, am I alone here? I thought we were rational human beings who look for facts and data and then put them together in a framework and decided what truth is, right? That's not what we do. Not to say that we can't do that or we can't be trained to overcome, our genetics, but reason is not used to seek the truth, but to justify our intuition.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me in terms of time, that you immediately do that. Does he say anything about...
I'm sorry, could you start over again?
Yeah, I said that seems reasonable in terms of time. Does he say anything in the book about whether people then try to correct after or think about it afterwards?
I'm not sure to the extent that he treats that specifically.
Okay, I have to get the book.
Yeah, you do have to get the book, and I can't quote it verbatim about the whole thing. I think, as I said before, we can use reason to moderate and rethink things. We certainly can learn.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. There was another question here? I'm happy to take questions as we go, by the way, at least until I get way behind schedule. So, okay. But the takeaways here, intuition is important. So first impressions matter. They make a big difference. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression, right? And it sets up your friends, your associates' intuition by that first impression. And so one of the things that we also want to do is listen. Seek first to understand. Listen deeply. Listen actively. that's something that, I'll speak for myself, and I think I've seen it in many other folks. When you encounter a view that differs from your own, there's this overwhelming compulsion to dive in and contradict or contest something. That's maybe not the best approach. Stop, pause, listen, seek deeper understanding. And then, if you can be a trusted messenger, if you can identify yourself with somebody that would be regarded as trustworthy by the person you're talking with, that'll go a long way to helping you get that intuition thing. So the next thing is morality is frequently thought of as harm and fairness. The traditional focus of moral studies, moral essays, and so forth, focus on those two dimensions, those two values, if you will. Haidt has discovered, though, that there's a much more varied and richer mix of values that guide people's sense of morals. Okay, we'll look at some of those. And you know, there's a sense for most of us that the morality is you know, it's fundamental. It's maybe if you're a faith-based person, maybe it's a God-given thing, or it's a feature of the universe. But there's a lot of evidence that these things can actually be learned. And so, you know, that's something for us to attend to. Here are the 5 dimensions of morality as Haidt has identified them. This chart, just to explain them for a minute, is from very liberal on the left to very conservative on the right, with you have strongly felt or strongly endorsed or strongly reject the particular values. The values, if you can't read them back there, are care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So you see there's a pattern, there's some patterns here. This is, you know, pretty significant. Liberals have a very large differentiation between care and fairness and loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Care and fairness is sort of the thing for liberals. More conservative voters have a different view. They also have you know, depends on what you consider high, they also consider care and fairness important, but they also consider loyalty, authority, and sanctity important, as contrasted with liberals who don't consider those very important. Okay, this paints a landscape that is important for us to understand if we're one of these people who wants to communicate with one of these people. You know, conversely, for one of these people who wants to communicate with one of these people. Yes?
Please clarify what sanctity means in this case.
Sanctity is like holiness.
Abstinence-only education.
Huh?
Abstinence-only education. Right? It goes under sanctity.
Could be. It could be. There's the idea of there are certain things that are, I'm going to say holy. There's probably other synonyms as well.
Beyond reproach, maybe.
Got it, thank you.
Thank you.
Beyond reproach.
More than that, otherworldly almost, supernatural sort of thing. Religion is a piece of that for sure. Yeah. Well, religious authority has some of both of those. Authority is another separate value. Anyway, yes.
Where do the ethical values come in?
The moral and ethical are synonymous here. Okay, so I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at this. You know, I often think that, you know, this fairness value, fairness and care value, trumps everything else. When I feel that way, I know where I sit on this. And it's important to realize that, okay, well, I mean, who's to say exactly what is right? You know, we have deeply held feelings. But, you know, if I want to talk to somebody over here, I don't want to denigrate their loyalty to a group or their care, their appreciation of authority or care for some, you know, other sanctified dimension. So really, really important, I think. So here, you know, we have to think about, you know, transforming those terms into, here's a, let's see, yes, sanctity. Importance of disgusting things. I don't know if that's, you know, really general enough or not. You know, it helps you understand what we're talking about. And then there's some kind of do's and don'ts. I'll let you look at those really quickly. But you know, when the idea that trying to communicate with somebody else who holds values different than your own, it's pretty important to understand what those values are before you dive in too deeply. Right? Because you can stick your foot in your mouth and then the conversation's over before it even starts. Right? So that's I think maybe the takeaway. So understanding your audience is crucial. Third principle, morality binds and blinds. Kind of a nice soundbite. The bind part means that we gravitate to others who hold the same sort of moral framework that we do. We just naturally come together in those kinds of groups. They bind us together. So, and here I use the word, I hope this term tribe in this context is not pejorative to anybody here. You know, I mean this in the sense of groups, because, you know, I think we're seeing really powerful evidence that we are very tribal today. And it seems to be getting worse, not better. And, you know, what this conversation is about is trying to, you know, break down those divisions, trying to talk across those divides. The people are tribal. They bind together into groups. They trust and look for validators. They listen to people that are spokesmen for their tribe. Those people carry extraordinary weight. You know, in some respects, you feel like sometimes that relieves people of having to actually think for themselves. But you know, whatever. We all do it. We all do it. And then the other thing is the blinding part. We have an intellectual framework that blinds us to information that does not comport with that framework. It bounces off. It's like Teflon stuff. In fact, how many of you here are familiar with the backfire effect? Anybody heard of the backfire effect? This is an established principle through social psychological experimentation that when somebody holds a belief fairly deeply and they're presented with contrary information, it reinforces their previous belief. What? How could that be? That's what actually happens. Most people they hear this and they go back to that first principle that I said, where reason is used to substantiate their intuition. When they're encountered with information that contradicts their preconceptions, their brains go into overdrive to explain why that information can't be right and how they know they were right even more profoundly than they were a moment previous. Makes, you know, sort of rational discussion pretty difficult. Okay, but I think I can say it's a fact. It's a fact in the sense that it's a well-established principle. So what about it? What do you do about that? The way to get past that is find a connection, find a way to become a trusted observer before you launch into, let's say, the climate science discussion, for instance. Telling a skeptic why he's full of it, because 97% of scientists know better than he does. Yeah, I mean, that's probably where you want to go. So let's talk about conservatives.
Question?
Yes?
Finding a way to become trusted has come up multiple times as a solution. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you establish a tone of trust?
Yeah, great question. We'll get to that a little bit later, but
I can wait.
No, real quickly, and we will get to it later in more depth. Real quickly, the key, I think, is to ask a person what their beliefs are, what their thoughts are, before you dive in. Ask them, then ask them again, and ask them a third time, and read back to them what you think you heard, trying to validate and affirm what they're telling you. Try and find a way to validate and affirm what they're telling you. And then find something in there that gives you an opening to morph the conversation a little bit to what you would like to talk about. But couch it in terms that can be received. In fact, some of the people will tell us, you know, you really don't even want to introduce your policy prescription, your idea, until they invite you to do so. So establish that connection to the point where, you know, what do you think about this? I hear you saying that you care about thus and so and so. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? You know, I'm concerned about that too. I understand where you're coming from. You know, have that kind of conversation, and eventually, and I have some other ideas too. If you know, we could talk about if you care to. You know, keep going for a little while. Eventually, they'll say, well, "What do you think about that?" So that's kind of like, you're not going to make yourself the spokesman for their tribe, but you're going to establish yourself as an interested party that, you know, maybe has a connection that they can respect and listen to. Okay? So we'll come back to that again. We're going to talk a little bit, or quite a little bit, about Republicans and conservatives. By the way, I didn't say earlier on that Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonpartisan organization. We are decidedly and determinatively nonpartisan. Okay? And that's really hard for some of us. But we think that's the way to a viable and a durable political solution, because we need to find a bipartisan coalition that will pass federal legislation. You know, we need 60 votes in the Senate. Right? You guys understand the way that arithmetic works. So, you know, trying to get Republicans on board is really important. I'm guessing that's why many of you are in this room right now. So thinking about Republicans and climate generally, these numbers here reflect the total U.S. population. Okay, about a third of Americans they self-identify as Republicans. There's a bigger group that would tend to vote Republican, as is obvious. But you know, the survey work that Yale and George Mason have done will identify that only about a quarter of them are really climate skeptics, and we'll define what climate skeptics are here in a minute. But you know, half of the Republicans, only half, you know, it depends on how you look at this. Is the glass half full or half empty? Only half of the Republicans could be characterized as climate skeptics.
The other half aren't downright deniers? Or a third of the other half?
No, skeptics include deniers by that definition.
That's active denial
Fair
versus
question. Fair question. You know, tricks with data, right? So this is a depiction of the Republican Party that the New York Times published just before the presidential election. So what's that, 2.5 years old, 2016 election just before. So it kind of characterizes the size of the electorate group that would vote Republican, and identifies these coalitions and blocks within blocks. I think it's really fascinating. First off, and there's in a dimension here. There's a divide on this chart that is worth understanding. There are some groups who, at least before the election, couldn't stand Donald Trump. You know, what they said was that they would not and could not support Donald Trump. You know, since he was elected president, some of that seems to have changed, but still, that was an important philosophical and intellectual division, I think. And then a whole bunch of people who were very happy, or at least would tolerate Donald Trump, right? And so there's this cultural coalition, biblical refuseniks, which these are people who are very strongly faith-based, who will have nothing to do with Donald Trump because of, you know, I think, his morals, his ethical behavior or lack thereof. Whereas there is a much larger group that identify themselves as faith-based Republicans who would tolerate it. And then there's a larger, you know, cultural protectionist bloc, you know, preserving the sanctity of, you know, our national identity, whatever the heck that is.
What?
Do I not want to?
You're not using that.
I'm purposefully not using that, right. But the white nationalists are certainly in one of these, or some of these, yeah. And maybe in the upper corner of the alt-right, yeah. So, I mean, you know, so that's the cultural coalition. And there's a sort of an economic or anti-tax and anti-spending coalition, free market bloc. These are the people that I would have identified as, you know, traditional Republicans, maybe Reagan Republicans, something like that. This includes people like
McCain,
Paul Ryan, John Boehner, folks like that. You know, before the election again. This over here we've got, you know, this is Mike Pence, Ted Cruz, this is Ann Coulter, and, you know, sort of thing. And then, but back to the economics, and there's this large group of people who are motivated by economics.
Where's Trump?
It's identified as populist pessimistic. What Trump did that just surprised everybody is he captured those voters. Captured the populist folks who, many of whom had traditionally voted Democrat for years. Labor, white labor folks, for instance, who felt they'd been left behind. You know, they joined this party. And then there's the National Security Coalition, people who are really activist hawks who want to get involved everywhere in the world, and then those who, you know, they're strong national security people, but don't want to get involved around the world. There's that kind of difference. This is Trump, America first. We need to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan and everywhere else. At least that was his story before the election. So, you know, let's see. I guess that just gives the labels to what I'm talking about. The point of all this is, you know, if you think the Republicans are one thing, no, they're not one thing. They're a whole lot of different things that somehow came together to get a majority of electoral votes.
I want to be able to connect the sanctity, loyalty, authority, you know, that model you were using, with what I'm seeing, you know, on the right. I think more of the self-interest, greed, fear, and racism. How do those things connect with each other then? I mean, I want to be able to talk to that, but if those are the motivations and not these other things,
well,
then
yeah, it's a great question, because I think you're describing two sides of a coin. You know, you're choosing to see greed and racism. They themselves, in their mind, I don't think most of them are considering themselves as racist. They see, you know, support of a loyal and traditional lifestyle as most important thing. Okay, so what I would challenge you to do is try and think about it the way they do. Think about their framework the way they do. I don't think there's hardly anybody. I mean, those white supremacists, and by the way, you know, you got the white supremacists on the one hand, you got the Antifa people on the other hand too. So I mean, You know, those people are outliers. Whoop, did I say something wrong? Anyway, my view is that, you know, there are extremists on both ends. And, you know, there's a segment of the population that maybe are very happy to embrace really radical, out of mainstream ideas. But I don't think that reflects anywhere near the majority of the people that we're looking at that are under Trump. I could be wrong. That's my view. And, you know, I think there's plenty of evidence. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to reinforce that for another important reason besides, if you're having that kind of a conversation with one person with whom you differ, you can kind of work through the kind of strategies you're talking about. If you're talking to a half a dozen people who are of that same group, no one person in that group will take the risk of losing status among their pals by caving in to you. So talking to like a half a dozen people, like if you want to engage the anti-abortion people that protest outside of Planned Parenthood, you will not make any progress engaging the whole group of them. But if you know one of those individuals who happens to be the neighbor down the street, you can talk with that neighbor down the street apart from the rest of that cohort.
Right. Good. Excellent point.
Well, and you can talk about the nuances, you know, sometimes everything gets so black and white, and then when you start talking in the gray, you find out you really
Right.
do have areas you have.
Absolutely
agree on.
right. And what's going on, you know, the people within the group don't necessarily agree or see things the same way. So one thing we respond to that, and that aggravates somebody else. You know, one of the things they tell public speakers is know your audience, right? That's crucial in any audience for sure, right? You can actually do that to good effect with small audiences, let alone one-on-one. I've now been talking about climate for a number of years and had, you know, several dozen presentations, and I think a lot about that. One of the biggest frustrations to me is that it's not possible to know my audience in the sense that the audience is not going to be monolithic. It's going to be varied, and you might find people in the audience from the extremes. So when you're talking to one, you can be pretty sure you're going to piss off the other. And so, you know, that's a hazard that you deal with. So question.
We have someone down here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I found that using Thanksgiving dinner for family, talking about, you know, all the differences and stuff, you already have a personal bond with those people, and it does, I think, make it easier to you know, converse, really, and make those little inroads.
That's a double-edged sword. Yeah, I mean,
It's
you know,
working for us.
yeah, well, fabulous, wonderful. I think that's really important. You got to be lots of questions here. Thank you.
To get an idea of our challenge here, what percentage of people incline more to this intuitive reaction to things versus a more rational one? What are the kind of the percentages that
I don't have that information. I'm not sure that Haight has it. I think, based on my understanding of this research, it's 99% are reacting intuitively first, and the reason
That's why our visual cortex is so big. Our brain is mostly visual, designed to spot danger very, very quickly and make an assessment very, very quickly based on, you know, to survive.
Yeah, we are this way. We evolved this way. That's what his research indicates.
Sorry.
Where does letter
Humans are
writing come
messy.
in? Is it, supposing, for example, that I wanted to start writing letters to a new mutual fund that we bought that I'm concerned that isn't as explicitly green as could be, you know, is that, where does that fall on the scale?
Yeah, I guess I would ask for us to talk about that off on the side. I think that's a little different thing, because when you're writing, it's not so much a conversation. You know, what I'm talking about is having a live, real-time interaction. And I think that's, you know, what the research indicates is that's what's necessary in order to have any hope of reaching people. If you know, it's like an op-ed. You can develop a whole big op-ed, you know, the perfectly wonderful rational case. It ought to convince everyone in the universe. But it doesn't. You know, first off, because the people you really want to reach see the headline and then don't stop reading.
In the history of climate denial, like we know, like the New York Times has been writing about it. We're learning that less than half a dozen scientists were paid to write op-eds denying climate science, and then they were cited thousands of times and created the only political party in the world that denies climate change. And so, like, I hear a lot, like a one-on-one thing, like it's cool to be skilled in that. Like it's cool tactically, strategically, I question it. I really want to wonder, like this kind of feel-good presentation, like type of like, let's try cap and dividend, which had good momentum 10 years ago and just fizzled out. We're trying the same thing over and over. What about like talking about like using lies and manipulation and fear-mongering?
Yeah.
Like that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I want people to be scared.
It's already in use
People are
right
talking
now,
about their
though.
kids. I'm somebody's kid. Like
Yeah.
I'm worried about myself.
God bless you. There, you know, there's a
We
huge
gotta be
information
extremists.
campaign, and there's lots of information like that. What I hear you seeking is rational arguments to, you know, to overcome, you know, misinformation and people's conceptions. And, you know, more power to you. I mean, what I'm trying to suggest to you here is that there's another way to work that may be more effective, at least in certain situations. Now, I'm not saying don't do that. Okay? I mean, just like I'm also not saying don't work on state legislation. I'm also not saying there is no other federal policy other than CFD that could work. You know, I'm just, you know, I think there's a framework here and some information that is really, really helpful guidance. Yes?
One of the things that I found seems to work, and for lack of a better term, I call it the Detective Columbo approach. And that is to just sort of say, help me understand why you feel this way or what, you know, where you're coming from. Because I'm having a hard time here. And then just shut up and listen.
That's exactly what I was trying to explain or visualize for you in response to this lady's question, which is how to make yourself a trusted messenger. Get them to give you some cues on how to, and that's the perfect approach. Just what I'm saying. Yes.
I just want to recommend another book called Strangers in Their Own Land. It's a research project by a UC Berkeley sociologist, and she went to Louisiana, a certain area where there's been horrible environmental degradation, and she wanted to understand why, from a liberal point of view, why this cognitive dissonance? Why do they keep voting against their own interests? She discovered really nice people who are grieving the loss of their waterways. They can't fish, for example, in their rivers, etc. And yet they keep voting for those who want to perpetuate that. And so you mentioned before about a particular conservative point of view of leaving the validators like corporate interests. And that's illustrated in this book, that the chemical and gas companies who come in and take over with their corporations, they're bringing in jobs and lots of money, which really isn't true, but they like the sound of it. So there's that, and the validator, you know, the corporations, but also religious organizations. And they'd rather vote for somebody who believes in Jesus, even though they don't really care about protecting the health of the people and the environment. So it's a really interesting illustration of the principles we're talking about.
It's complicated, and you know, we'll look at a issue dimension matrix in a minute that'll illuminate that a little bit as well.
Strangers in Their Own Land. It came out just before the election.
It's on Audible as well.
Yeah, cool.
I suspect you're getting to this, but building on the last two comments, how does one break through then people's concepts of loyalty? People will have a loyalty to Rush Limbaugh. whatever he says is the truth.
Yeah, so, I mean,
How do you chip through that?
yeah, let me try and get to that. I think I've got some material.
John,
The
you-
time check is about
10
16
minutes.
minutes. 10
Yeah.
minutes.
10 minutes.
And we got till 11:10, so that's 16
Oh.
minutes. Are you my official proctor here? Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. I need it, thank you. That's very valuable, thank you. So here's some data that looks at what Republicans think about climate. The first two bars, there's three categories here, three sets of bars, if you will. This is the American electorate at large. This is the GOP. This is conservative GOP. And the first two bars are the ones that I'd like you to focus on. Those are the fraction of people who believe that the climate is changing and that humans are responsible for it. The green bar is the climate is changing and humans are at least a little bit responsible for it, to some degree responsible for it. And then it goes downhill from there. But the thing that I would ask you to focus on is the sum of the two, the green and the blue bars, even amongst conservatives. More than half know that the climate is changing and believe that humans are responsible for at least some of it. So the idea that, Republicans are all deniers? What? No, it's not true.
How recent is that data?
Pardon me?
How recent is that data?
Might have been on the chart.
Pretty recent.
16.
Well, and there's even a new study out from Yale that says the numbers are even better.
Okay. Yeah, except it's not broken down by, I don't think it's broken down by party, is it? I don't think it's broken down by party, but.
I think so.
Okay, I need to be tuned up and I'll take your word for it. And the migration is moving in a favorable direction. I think that's your point. That is true and has been true for years. How many of you familiar with the Six Americas concept from Yale and again, George Mason with them this together? Not that many. This is a really wonderful way to think about our population, I think. They break into 6 categories what people think about climate change. From alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. Right? And, if you think about the people that, know that it's real and are at least cautious, so in other words, these first 3 categories, 3/4 of Americans at large are in one of those 3 categories. But interestingly, close to half, and very possibly with the latest information, maybe half of Republicans are also in those 3 categories. So when you think about, who is it that we're trying to reach, what I think we're really we're doing is we're trying to build the political will for a livable world, right? That's the CCL model. And, what you got to do is get a majority of Americans or enough Americans to elect a majority of electoral votes, depending on what the context is, right? And so, working really hard on these folks is, that's not where the leverage is. The leverage is here.
I used to live in Disengaged 2 years ago.
So did I.
And now I'm a chapter leader. Vancouver. Sharon Brown.
Sharon! I've been seeing you on the TV and I didn't recognize you from the Zoom meeting, so. It's a pleasure. That's great.
Just thought I'd chime
me
in
too.
there.
You said
I used to live down
4
that.
years ago, I was, disengaged. Good question.
Could you distinguish between disengaged and dismissive a little bit?
Disengaged are, they don't know, they don't care. Dismissive is, yes, I hear about that, that's all BS. That's just a whole piece of Chinese.
As a former Air Force meteorologist surrounded by conservatives, working in the science field, there's so many people in my career field that are dismissive of climate change, which blows my mind. So I've realized that even though I have the the education and experience to say, hey, there is climate change. At certain points, I just have to stop. If your message isn't getting through, fighting through it isn't the way to communicate.
Exactly, exactly. Making a contest or trying to refute is not likely to be productive. And I think there might be some of the phenomena going on that this gentleman talked about. I mean, if that's in a group setting, you know, they're a member, they're loyal to their group. Right? You're not going to get them in a group setting. You can have coffee with them separately, you know, and not in one, it won't be one meeting, you know, it might be a series of coffees. Understand?
There are a large number that are in this cautious middle situation, including people who are conservative. But our problem is that our politics, as opposed to just our thinking, is so polarized that they hate Democrats so much that they won't vote for a Democrat and they won't support anything if there's in Congress that is a Democrat. How do we get over that so that they actually vote the way they believe?
I don't know, and it's because I guess my belief is that, you know, you chip away at the edges, you have a conversation where you can find something to agree on, and that, you know, that becomes a, you know, a chink in the armor, if you will. You know, I mean, that starts a process of rethinking. Maybe that's what I believe, and that's what I do. But the environment here is horrible in that respect, and it seems to be getting worse. If people like us don't make a, you know, conscientious effort to try and bridge the divide, then you know, it's just going to be downhill from here. And let me make another point about climate. You know, it used to be that climate was not a partisan issue. You know, remember, Richard Nixon signed the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, right? Somewhere in the 2000s, you know, it became a partisan issue. It got to be associated with and identified with the Democratic Party, and the Tea Party came up, and, you know, anything that the Democrats support, by definition, we're gonna be opposed. Again, CCL is nonpartisan, but we do see that landscape. And, you know, that's why we are dedicated to trying to reach across the aisle. In fact, we are working really, really hard to make climate, again, be a bridge issue, not a wedge issue. And there are many initiatives that are, you know, before us today that, you know, that could potentially make it even a more profound wedge issue. We don't want that. We want to find a way to fit it. Sharon?
I think one thing to, you know, just in my experience is, and I'll do it real quick, is that, you know, if you're a conservative, and I tend towards that direction, is that it feels like sometimes that you're being asked to choose between the economy and saving the planet. You know, and that whole thing with Yellow Jackets and France kind of is an example of that. And so that's what I love about CCL, is because I get to do both. I get to save the economy and save the planet at the same time. It's wonderful.
Yep, I agree completely. So, one more comment, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, there's a small number of Republicans, I forget who they were, who were talking about creating some climate legislation. And they were doing it saying we need to come up with an alternative to the extremism of the Green New Deal. And so the first thing to get Republicans in Congress to actually talk about climate legislation wasn't bridging divides. It was creating an extreme for them to fight against, to come to the middle.
So they had to come up with an alternative.
I can't, I wouldn't attempt to refute that. I mean, I think that maybe both strategies actually.
I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
In what little time we have left, can you talk about some tools, techniques, approaches we can use to break through these walls?
Yeah, okay.
We got a lot of data, but can you talk about some approaches?
Sure. Let me go quickly here. I just want to make one point here, which is, you know, it reinforces the point already made. You know, what happened of the Republicans. This is the 5 categories six categories broken down by political party. And you can see about half of the Republicans are in at least cautious or better. And these are old data, almost 10 years old. It's probably more favorable. So, okay, it's a fair question, and I'm going to try and get to it with 5 minutes to go. One point to make here is, and I think this helps us understand a little bit about why, if half Republicans really care about climate, why aren't they doing something about it? I know you can't read this, and I don't want you to. What I do want you to notice is the dimensions of this matrix. This is how important the issue is in those 6 Americas categories. And the people who are alarmed about climate change have environment, climate change, and clean energy as their top priority issues. As you go across that matrix, those 3 categories become less and less important. There's 23 separate issue areas identified here. And so by the time you get to even the cautious folks, these 3 dimensions are, they're like number 15 or lower. And so they're concerned, but not that concerned compared to the other things that they're concerned about. So that's a focus as well. Okay, I'm gonna run out of time to do all the things I wanted to do, but here's an important issue for conservatives. I think you heard me say that I didn't take action because I didn't conceive of an approach that wouldn't change our way of life. That is the kind of thought that is just right in the middle of most conservatives. That's the framework. When you hear climate change, what does it hear? I want your money, right? There's a bunch of other things that we talk about. So, I'm moving fast. What does 3 guys have in common? They're American. Don't trust your messengers. They're spokesmen for their tribe, right? And so they give significant deference to their leaders. The point here is, find a trusted messenger that you can refer to. George Shultz, for example, who promotes the carbon fee and dividend, and Greg Mankiw, an economist. Here's I'm going to go fast to some tools. Here's Jennifer. Just met her. She's really friendly. She's conservative. What does she think? Climate change not important? Taxes are bad. I don't want the government telling me what to do. How do you frame your question here? These are some things that are not going to be that effective, and a set of things that probably are going to be more effective in establishing that initial connection with her. Okay? Don't dump the doom and gloom on her. Don't beat her up with the climate justice thing. That's not where she is. It's not where she's coming from. But if you can talk about climate as a risk to the economy, to jobs, to our quality of life, there's some openings there. Those are some techniques to get started. But again, before you can get started, you want to ask. Before you even get started with the messaging, you want to do that asking that we talk about. The Columbo thing, I love that. I love that image. Thank you. Engage them in a discussion to get some sense of where they're coming from, so you don't stick your foot in your mouth just right off the bat. Right? But once you've gotten there, and once, if you have the patience, which I encourage you, you've been invited to present your story, then think about, these things. Tackle the solution of urgency. Don't introduce an idea that's going to just change everybody's way of life. One that has been misquoted all the time now, but's gotten a huge amount of press is, no, but we're not going to be able to fly anywhere anymore. I mean, that kind of thing is that's going over. Here are some ideas for getting. Yeah, beef, hamburgers, right? No more meat.
I think as a grandmother, I could talk about that. I would talk about family and how concerned I am about the future of my family.
Resume, maybe?
Yeah. Again, it depends upon the individual, but very likely.
Family.
Sure. I mean, explore that.
Do we have access to this slideshow?
I hope so. I'm sorry, all the good, all the stuff that this gentleman wants is still buried, and I'm not gonna get to it.
2 hours.
But, no, not only the rest of my slides are, but, okay, here's Sam. He's a progressive. What's he think? I mean, again, there's two sides to this coin, right? Most of us here are liberals or progressives. But if you're a conservative, or even if you're not, even if you're moderate, I mean, you can encounter folks who are kind of out, maybe out there with respect to how our economy and our system works, right? And again, there are some things that are probably not going to be relevant, or might even piss the person off, and other things that are relevant. Notice how these two charts are almost inverted, right?
Yeah.
This is why I know your audience thing, trying to have one message for everybody, not going to work very well. You need to know your audience and then be able to adapt. I'll also say that for a lot of people, this becomes an ethical issue for themselves. In other words, talking about something that can be favorably received by your audience may feel phony or inauthentic or somehow, wrong. So, think about that. Think deeply about that. I'm not advising anybody to lie or misrepresent themselves, but I think you can, adjust your frame of reference to communicate with people that you're trying to get to.
I'm just going to say, from my experience, you don't have to, with the other question, you don't have to agree on the causes to be able to talk about, most people will recognize something's going on with the climate, so what can we do?
Right.
And if they want to think God is doing it or whatever makes them happy, it really doesn't matter.
Right, exactly right. And you're talking about the half who don't necessarily accept it. And, what I'd ask you to focus on is the half that do and move them to activism.
I saw a video of, it was Al Gore with one of the leaders of the Tea Party, and she wants to protect the environment. And she said, don't use the word regulation with us.
Yeah.
Use the word protection, and
Right.
we'll listen to you. A lot of times it's the language you use.
Forgive me, I'm racing through this, but I want to give you a flavor of what's there. Here are the pointers that you're looking for. When you hear an objection, don't take the bait. Don't dive in and instantly try and refute. Don't take the bait. Listen deeply for values. What's more deeply behind what it is that they're talking about? And find something in what they said that you can relate to and reinforce, and if possible, agree with. That makes you an agreeable partner in the conversation. All of a sudden, the intuition turns from, unfavorable to favorable. Pivot to the solution, avoid, try to avoid something that looks like, they have to give up everything that is important to them in their lifestyle. Here's a couple of examples real quick. These are some examples that Jennifer might come up with. Right? You've encountered these. Right?
And give you cancer.
They call it the
Sorry, we're over time, so now we're going to be cutting into the next section.
Yeah. Oh, do we go to lunch?
Next session.
Thank you.
How could we